Hello, everyone. More than 2,000 years ago, there lived a man whose name would echo across history. A man both adored and despised, worshipped as a god and cursed as a tyrant. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. For some, he was the greatest leader Rome ever produced, a visionary who dragged a crumbling republic into a new age of order and glory. For others, he was the destroyer of freedom, the ambitious general whose hunger for power ended the very republic he claimed to protect. Even today, the world remembers him not just as a man, but as a symbol. The word Caesar itself became a title for kings and emperors. Kaiser in Germany, Tsar in Russia, echoes of one man's name stretching through the ages. But who was he really? A genius or a monster? A savior or a destroyer? Perhaps both. Born into a noble but declining family, Caesar entered a world of chaos. Rome was torn apart by corruption, betrayal, and endless civil wars. He rose from obscurity, hunted, exiled, and nearly executed, to become the most powerful man alive. With unmatched brilliance and ruthless ambition, he conquered Gaul, bent the Senate to his will, and reshaped the Roman world forever. He crossed the Rubicon, defying the Republic itself, and plunged Rome into civil war, all in the name of destiny. He loved deeply, fought ferociously, and ruled absolutely. And yet, at the height of his triumph, surrounded by power and glory, he was struck down by those he once called his friends. Et tu, Brute, even you, my son. Those words, whether spoken or imagined, became the eternal symbol of betrayal. The mighty Caesar, stabbed 23 times beneath the statue of his fallen rival, dying not as a god, but as a man. But even in death, Caesar triumphed. His murder did not restore the Republic. Instead, it unleashed a new era, the birth of the Roman Empire under his adopted heir, Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. And so the name Caesar would never die. It became a title, a legacy, a warning. He was the man who dared to seize the world, and in doing so, lost his life, but gained eternity. This is the story of Julius Caesar, the soldier, the lover, the reformer, the ambitious general whose hunger for power ended the very republic would change the course of history forever. Even today, Rome, in Caesar's time, was a city devouring itself. What had once been a proud republic, governed by laws, honor, and debate, had descended into chaos. Corruption ruled the Senate, power shifted by the sword, and men no longer served the Republic. They served themselves. At the heart of this storm stood Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the most feared man alive. A brilliant general turned ruthless dictator, Sulla seized power through blood. He filled the city with fear. The streets echoed with the sound of executions, and the air reeked of burning flesh. Sulla's rule was marked by one terrifying invention: the prescriptions, public death lists. Anyone whose name appeared on them was marked for death. Their property was seized, their families ruined, and their heads displayed in the forum as warnings. Terror became law, and in the shadows of this horror, a young noble named Gaius Julius Caesar was beginning his life. He was born into the ancient Julian clan, one of Rome's oldest families, but by his time, their wealth and influence had withered. His bloodline was noble, yet his home was modest. But what he lacked in gold, he possessed in something far more dangerous: ambition. Through his family, Caesar was tied to Gaius Marius, Sulla's greatest rival. Marius had been a war hero, a man of the people, and Sulla hated him. When Sulla took power, he destroyed Marius's faction, killing anyone connected to him. But fate had already bound Caesar to Marius's legacy. He had married Cornelia, the daughter of one of Marius's strongest supporters. When Sulla discovered this, he summoned the young Caesar and gave him a simple command: divorce her, or die. It was a test of loyalty, one that no sane man would fail. Yet Caesar refused. He was barely 18. He had no army, no fortune, and no protection. But he would not betray his wife. That defiance enraged Sulla. He stripped Caesar of his title as Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter. He confiscated his inheritance, and he declared him an enemy of the state. Caesar became a hunted man. He fled Rome under cover of night, moving through villages and forests, constantly changing his name and disguise. Soldiers were sent to find him. Several times they nearly succeeded. He bribed captors, hid in huts, and crossed swamps to survive. He was captured once, and only escaped through the desperate pleas of friends who bribed his guards with everything they owned. Every step of his journey was soaked in fear, yet that fear never broke him. It sharpened him. After months on the run, Caesar's allies begged Sulla for mercy. They reminded him that the boy was just that, a boy. Sulla finally relented. He let Caesar live. But as he did, he warned them, "You fools, you protect a man who carries within him many Mariuses. One day he will be the end of the Republic." Even Sulla, in all his arrogance, saw something in the young man that others didn't. Destiny. When Sulla died, Caesar returned to Rome. But the city was still rotten to its core. The Senate was divided, generals were at war, and the people starved while the rich feasted. Caesar saw what the Republic had become, a system ruled by greed and fear. He wanted more than survival. He wanted change, and perhaps deep down he wanted revenge. But he was no fool. He knew that power in Rome was not seized overnight. So he turned to the one place where courage and loyalty still meant something: the army. He volunteered for military service, leaving behind the poisonous politics of Rome. In the legions, Caesar found discipline, purpose, and brotherhood. And for the first time, he learned what true power felt like, not from wealth or title, but from command. He quickly proved himself in battle. In one campaign, he saved a comrade's life, cutting down the enemy with his own sword while bleeding from his wounds. For that act of bravery, he was awarded the civic crown, one of Rome's highest honors. It was a simple wreath made of oak leaves, yet for Caesar it meant everything. It was proof that courage could carve a path where birthright could not. He wore it proudly, not as a trophy, but as a promise to himself, that he would rise. Years later, when he returned to Rome, he was no longer the frightened boy who fled Sulla's wrath. He had seen blood, he had seen death, he had tasted glory, and he had learned that in Rome loyalty could be bought, but fear was priceless. He began to study how power truly worked, how crowds could be swayed by words, how favors could buy loyalty, and how ambition, when hidden behind charm, could conquer empires. Julius Caesar was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming something far greater, a force that would soon shake the foundations of the Republic itself. By the time Caesar returned to Rome, the Republic was drowning in corruption. The Senate had become a playground for the wealthy, a nest of conspiracies and backroom deals. Every vote could be bought, every law twisted for a price. And in this chaotic world, a young Caesar began his rise, not through money but through mastery of people. He was charming, eloquent, and fearless. He could win over the crowd with a single speech, make enemies doubt themselves with a single smile. To the poor, he was a champion. To the powerful, he was dangerous. He started small, serving as a military officer, then as a lawyer and public speaker. In every case he argued, he turned the courtroom into a stage. He spoke with passion, not politics. The people loved him because he sounded human, something Rome's elite had long forgotten how to be. But Caesar's ambitions were far greater than applause. He wanted power, real power, and he knew Rome's system too well to think he could do it alone. He began climbing the political ladder, winning minor offices, building alliances, and carefully crafting his image as a man of the people. He borrowed money recklessly, throwing lavish public games and feasts. Crowds adored him, creditors despised him. But Caesar understood something most didn't. Popularity was a form of currency, and he was willing to go into debt to buy it. Among the Senate's old guard, whispers began to spread. They called him dangerous, ambitious, unpredictable. And they were right. When Caesar was elected Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, he was barely 40. It was one of the highest positions in the Republic, a symbol of prestige and power. But to Caesar, it was just another step toward something greater. He ran his campaigns with the precision of a general, every favor owed, every debt recorded, every ally remembered. He was building a network that reached across Rome. And then came the moment that would change everything. In the Republic, there were two men who stood above all others. The first was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. He controlled banks, trade, and entire neighborhoods of the city. His power came from gold. The second was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general. He had conquered lands across the Mediterranean, returning to Rome as a hero of the people. His power came from the sword. But both men had enemies in the Senate. Crassus was resented for his greed. Pompey was feared for his army. And both needed something, someone, to unite them. That someone was Julius Caesar. Caesar saw what no one else could. If he could bring Crassus's money and Pompey's armies together, he could form a force greater than the Senate itself. So he did. In 60 BCE, the three men formed an unofficial alliance, a pact that would secretly rule Rome. They called it nothing. But history would call it the first triumvirate, the rule of three men. Each man brought something to the table. Pompey had military power and fame, Crassus had wealth and influence, and Caesar had strategy, the mind that could turn both into empire. Together they controlled elections, appointments, and even laws. Rome became their chessboard. Senators trembled, rivals vanished, and the Republic, once proud and free, was now ruled from the shadows. In return for his role in forging this alliance, Caesar was rewarded with the position he had long desired, consul of Rome, the highest office in the Republic. It was a stunning rise for a man who, only years earlier, had been hunted like a criminal. Now he was at the very heart of power. But Caesar was not satisfied. To him, the consulship was not a throne, it was a doorway, a step toward something larger than any title, immortality. As consul, Caesar pushed reforms that favored the poor and veterans, angering the Senate but delighting the masses. He used his authority to pass laws at lightning speed, often ignoring procedure entirely. His enemies called it tyranny. His supporters called it leadership. When his term as consul ended, the Senate tried to sideline him, to push him away from Rome, to make him irrelevant. Instead, they handed him exactly what he wanted: command of Gaul, the wild frontier beyond the Alps. The Senate thought they were sending Caesar away. They had no idea. They were sending him to become a god of war. When Julius Caesar left Rome for Gaul, he was not yet the legend we know today. He was ambitious, brilliant, and charming. But he was still just a man. By the time he returned, he would be something far greater and far more dangerous. Gaul, the vast land beyond the Alps, was wild and untamed, a patchwork of fierce tribes, warriors with painted faces who fought not for empire but for freedom. To the Romans, Gaul was chaos. To Caesar, it was opportunity. The Senate had given him command over several legions and the authority to govern the provinces of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul. They thought they were sending him into exile, far from the politics of Rome. But Caesar saw it differently. He was being given an army and a stage large enough to make the world remember his name. His first campaigns were swift and brutal. Tribe after tribe fell to his legions, disciplined, relentless, and terrifying. The Romans fought like machines, their formations perfect, their will unbreakable. And leading them from the front, sword in hand, was Caesar himself. He was not a general who watched from a distance. He fought beside his men, shared their food, endured their hardships. He called them comrades, not soldiers, and in return they would have followed him into the fires of hell. As victory followed victory, Caesar began writing his own legend. He sent reports back to Rome, calm, measured, and brilliant. He wrote in the third person, not as a boast, but as history itself speaking. Those reports became the commentaries on the Gallic War, a masterpiece of propaganda disguised as literature. Every sentence painted him as a hero, decisive, just, and destined for greatness. The people of Rome devoured his words. While his enemies whispered in the Senate, Caesar was winning the hearts of the Republic from hundreds of miles away. But the wars were not just against tribes. They were against time, hunger, rebellion, and nature itself. The battles of Gaul were unlike anything Rome had ever seen. At the Battle of the Sabes, Caesar's army was ambushed by tens of thousands of nervy warriors. For a moment it seemed that Rome would fall, but Caesar, refusing to retreat, grabbed a shield, charged into the front line, and rallied his men himself. His courage turned near defeat into total victory. Later came the legendary campaign against the Helvetii and the revolt of Vercingetorix, the proud Gallic leader who united the tribes against Rome. Vercingetorix was a warrior of vision, a man who saw Caesar for what he truly was, not just a general, but a conqueror of nations. At first, the Gallic tribes burned their own villages, destroyed their crops, and refused open battle, forcing Caesar's legions into exhaustion. But Caesar adapted. He learned their terrain, their tactics, their weaknesses. He built bridges across impossible rivers, fortresses in enemy lands, and supply lines that stretched across mountains. Every obstacle became a monument to Roman will. The war reached its climax at Alesia, a fortress atop a hill surrounded by valleys. Vercingetorix had gathered over 80,000 warriors. Caesar had fewer men, but he had something more powerful: discipline and genius. He ordered the construction of 2 massive walls, one encircling Alesia to trap the enemy inside, and another facing outward to protect against the relief forces coming to rescue them. It was one of the most daring feats of engineering in ancient warfare, a double siege, a fortress within a fortress. When the Gallic reinforcements finally attacked, Caesar's army fought on both sides at once, surrounded, outnumbered, but unbroken. For days, the battle raged. Then, as the sun rose on the final morning, the Gallic lines collapsed. The tribes fled. Vercingetorix, realizing the end had come, rode out of the city, dismounted before Caesar, and laid his sword at his feet. It was the moment Caesar became a god. The conquest of Gaul was complete. Rome's borders had expanded by hundreds of thousands of square miles. Millions were enslaved or killed. To Caesar's enemies, it was genocide. To his followers, it was glory. But to Caesar himself, it was destiny. He had proven that with will and brilliance, one man could bend the world to his vision. And he knew the people of Rome were waiting, hungry for their hero's return. But back in Rome, fear had begun to spread. The Senate whispered that Caesar had grown too powerful. Pompey, once his ally, now envied his fame. Crassus, his other partner, was dead. The alliance that once ruled Rome was collapsing, and Caesar, standing on the edge of his greatest triumph, was about to face a choice that would change history forever: to obey the Senate, or to defy it, to surrender his power, or seize it all. By the winter of 49 BCE, Julius Caesar stood at the height of his power. He had conquered Gaul, crushed rebellions, and expanded Rome's territory beyond imagination. For nearly a decade, he had led his legions through rivers of blood, across mountains, through storms, and never once had they been defeated. To his men, he was not just a general. He was a god of war. He shared their hardships, fought beside them, and rewarded them with gold and glory. Every soldier in the 13th Legion would have died for him, without hesitation. But for the men in Rome, the old senators and noble families, Caesar was no hero. He was a monster of their own making, a man who had tasted too much power, too much victory, and who now commanded an army more loyal to him than to the Republic itself. The Senate feared him, Pompey envied him, and together they began to plot his downfall. When Caesar's term as governor ended, the Senate, now under Pompey's influence, issued an order. He must disband his army, return to Rome, and face prosecution for overstepping his authority in Gaul. To most, it was a political maneuver. To Caesar, it was a death sentence. He knew that if he returned to Rome without his army, his enemies would destroy him in the courts, strip him of his titles, and erase his legacy. Everything he had built, every battle fought, every soldier lost, would mean nothing. At the same time, Caesar was not blind to the stakes. To defy the Senate was treason. To march on Rome was unthinkable. It meant civil war. It meant turning his sword, the same sword that had defended Rome's glory, against Romans themselves. For days he hesitated. He gathered his officers, pacing before the fire in his camp, silent and restless. The men could see the conflict within him. Duty versus destiny, law versus legacy. Some urged restraint, others whispered of revenge, but all waited for the one voice that mattered: Caesar's. Meanwhile in Rome, fear had turned to hysteria. The Senate declared Caesar an enemy of the state. Pompey raised his own legions, claiming to defend the Republic. Messengers arrived, breathless with news. Caesar was marching south. In truth, he had not yet moved. He stood before a small, quiet river in northern Italy, the Rubicon. On one side lay his province, where he was still a lawful governor. On the other side lay Italy, and beyond it, Rome, forbidden ground for any general with an army. Roman law was absolute. To cross that river with troops under arms was to declare war upon the Republic itself. The night was cold, the water dark and swift. Caesar's officers gathered, waiting for his word. Even they were uncertain whether he would truly dare to cross. Caesar stood at the riverbank, silent for a long time. He gazed at the current, the thin, moving line that separated obedience from rebellion, history from eternity. He knew that once he took that step, there would be no turning back. Rome would burn. Brothers would kill brothers, and his name, for all its glory, might one day be cursed. At last he turned to his men. His face was calm, his voice quiet but steady. "If I cross this river," he said, "there will be no peace. The Republic will fall, but if I do not, I will fall with it." He looked back at the Rubicon, and then forward, toward the land that had once been his home and would soon be his battlefield. Then he spoke the words that would echo through history, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast. And with that, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The march to Rome began. There was no turning back. But instead of resistance, Caesar found only silence. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected from Pompey's army to join his ranks. The people, long disillusioned with the Senate's corruption, cheered him as a savior. Pompey, unprepared for Caesar's speed, fled the city. The Senate followed him, carrying their treasure and the symbols of state. Rome, the eternal city, was abandoned without a fight. When Caesar entered, he found the capital eerily quiet. No crowds, no celebrations, only the echo of his soldiers' footsteps. He walked through the Forum, the same place where Sulla had once ruled through terror. But Caesar did not seek vengeance. He ordered that no one be harmed, that no houses be looted, that no blood be spilled. "We fight not against Rome," he told his men, "but for Rome." It was both a declaration and a justification. Soon after, Caesar began to consolidate control. He restored order, re-established laws, and prepared to face Pompey, who had retreated to Greece, raising a vast army from the eastern provinces. The civil war had begun in earnest. The fate of the Republic would now be decided not in the Senate, but on the battlefield. Caesar pursued Pompey with relentless precision. Everywhere he went, he was outnumbered, yet every time he outmaneuvered his enemies. His genius lay not in strength, but in strategy, speed, surprise, and the ability to read the human mind as if it were an open scroll. At Pharsalus in northern Greece, the two armies finally met. Pompey commanded nearly twice as many men, confident of victory. He believed Caesar's troops, exhausted from the long march, would break under pressure. But Caesar's veterans were made of iron. They had followed him through the forests of Gaul, across mountains and rivers, through storms and starvation. They had fought under his command for years, and they trusted him more than they feared death itself. As dawn broke, Caesar rode along the lines, speaking to his soldiers one by one. He reminded them that they were not fighting foreigners, but Romans. And yet, he told them, if we must shed Roman blood, let it be for a Rome reborn. The battle began in a roar of trumpets. Dust filled the air, arrows rained down, the clash of steel drowned out the cries of men. Pompey's cavalry charged, and Caesar's troops held. Then, in a sudden, brilliant maneuver, Caesar ordered his hidden reserve lines to flank the enemy's cavalry. Pompey's formation collapsed. Within hours, the great general who once ruled the Mediterranean fled the field in panic. Caesar stood victorious, but he did not celebrate. He looked upon the bodies of Roman soldiers lying dead on both sides and said quietly, "They were all my brothers." Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge under the young pharaoh Ptolemy III. But when Caesar arrived, he was handed a horrifying gift, Pompey's severed head, presented as a token of loyalty. The sight broke him. He turned away, weeping, and ordered Pompey's body to be buried with full honors. He had won the war, but lost his oldest ally, his rival, and perhaps a part of his own soul. Caesar was now the undisputed master of Rome. No army could challenge him. No senate could defy him. But deep down, he knew this victory was not the end. It was the beginning of something darker. He had crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey, and claimed the Republic for himself. But in doing so, he had set in motion a chain of events that no one, not even Caesar, could control. The world now belonged to him. And yet, in the distance, destiny whispered, "Every empire born in fire will one day burn the same way." After the dust of civil war settled, Caesar was no longer a mere general. He was the undisputed master of Rome, a man who had defied the Senate, defeated his enemies, and seized power with his own hands. But even as he stood victorious, the world beyond Rome was still in turmoil. In the east, the ancient kingdom of Egypt, rich, proud, and filled with secrets, was itself consumed by chaos. Its throne was claimed by two siblings, Ptolemy III, a boy king manipulated by greedy advisors, and Cleopatra, his brilliant, exiled sister. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he came not as conqueror, but as judge. He had pursued Pompey to Egypt, seeking to end the war once and for all. But what he found instead would change the course of his life. Pompey had reached Egypt first, hoping for refuge. But before Caesar could even meet him, Ptolemy's court had Pompey murdered, his severed head delivered to Caesar as a gift. Caesar recoiled in horror. He turned away, weeping. This was not mercy. This was betrayal. Pompey had been his rival, yes, but also his friend, his brother in arms. To avenge Pompey's dishonor, Caesar declared his intention to mediate Egypt's civil conflict himself. But this decision would soon lead him into one of history's most extraordinary relationships. Cleopatra, then only 21, was in exile on the edge of Egypt, stripped of her throne, hunted by her own brother. She knew that if she could win Caesar's favor, she might reclaim her kingdom and her destiny. But Caesar was heavily guarded. The palace in Alexandria was surrounded by enemies. So Cleopatra did the unthinkable. Under cover of night, she had herself rolled inside a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack, and smuggled through enemy lines into Caesar's private chambers. When the servants unrolled the bundle, there she was, young, radiant, wrapped in silk, her dark eyes shining with fire and defiance. It was not just beauty that captured Caesar's attention. It was brilliance. She spoke 7 languages, understood politics, and saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. In her, Caesar recognized a reflection of himself, ambition cloaked in charm, intelligence wrapped in grace. That night, an alliance was born, of passion and of power. Together, they reclaimed the throne. Caesar used his legions to defeat Ptolemy's armies, restoring Cleopatra to her rightful place as queen. The war in Egypt was swift but brutal. Streets ran red with blood, the royal palace burned, and the Nile itself carried the ashes of the fallen. Through it all, Cleopatra stood beside Caesar, not as a subject, but as an equal. When victory came, she entered Alexandria not as a pawn, but as a queen reborn. Caesar remained in Egypt for months, enthralled not only by the queen, but by the land itself, its temples, its mysteries, its sense of eternity. In those golden days, Rome's greatest general and Egypt's last pharaoh walked side by side along the banks of the Nile. They spoke of empire, of destiny, of the future, and from that union came a son, Caesarion, the child of Rome and Egypt, born to 2 worlds, heir to 2 crowns. But even love could not silence the call of politics. Back in Rome, whispers grew louder. The Senate feared that Caesar had become too powerful, too foreign, too godlike. They called Cleopatra a witch, an enchantress, a symbol of everything un-Roman. And yet Caesar brought her to Rome anyway, not as a captive, but as his guest. She arrived with splendor, golden barges, exotic servants, perfumes that filled the air. To the Romans, it was a spectacle both mesmerizing and scandalous. For the first time in centuries, they saw a woman treated as an equal by a Roman ruler. Caesar built her a villa across the Tiber, visited her openly, and presented their child to the world. It was not just love, it was defiance, a declaration that Caesar would no longer bend to the rules of tradition. He was reshaping Rome itself, not just through conquest, but through vision. He launched reforms to rebuild the Republic, ease poverty, and create order. He restructured the calendar, giving us what we now call the Julian calendar, a gift that outlived even his empire. He centralized power, reduced corruption, and claimed the title of dictator for life. But that title came at a cost. For the Senate, this was no longer the act of a savior. It was the birth of a king. And in a city that once killed its kings, that could mean only one end. Still, in his final years, Caesar seemed unstoppable. He stood on the steps of the Senate, wrapped in purple and laurel, his name spoken in temples, his statue placed among the gods. He had everything: power, fame, love, and legacy. But even the greatest of men cannot escape the fate written for them. As Cleopatra returned to Egypt carrying their child, a shadow began to gather in Rome, a shadow that would soon fall across Caesar himself. By the spring of 44 BCE, Julius Caesar stood at the pinnacle of human power. He had conquered lands across continents, crushed every rival, rewritten the laws of Rome, and reshaped the calendar of time itself. He was no longer just a general or a statesman. He was Rome. The Senate had named him dictator for life, an honor no Roman before him had ever received. His image was stamped on coins. His statue stood among the gods. Crowds chanted his name as if it were a prayer. But beneath that glory, the air of Rome trembled with unease. To some, Caesar was a savior, the man who ended decades of chaos and civil war. To others, he was a tyrant, a king in everything but name. And Rome, the republic born from the blood of kings, could not bear the thought of another. One afternoon, during a public festival, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, approached him with a golden diadem, a crown. He offered it to Caesar before the cheering crowd. Twice Caesar refused it, claiming he would never be king. But each refusal only deepened suspicion, because for the first time, people saw not the general or the reformer, but a man tempted by the taste of godhood. Whispers began to spread that Caesar was planning to declare himself king, that he would move the capital from Rome to Alexandria to rule beside Cleopatra, that the republic, proud, ancient, and free, was already dead. In the shadows of the Senate, fear became conspiracy. A group of senators began to meet in secret, men who once called Caesar friend, ally, even father. Among them were Cassius, a man of sharp mind and cold heart, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a man of principle, torn between love and duty. Brutus had fought for the republic his ancestors built, and now that republic was slipping away. Cassius saw in him the perfect symbol, the noble soul to justify their act. Together they formed a plot, to kill Caesar, not for hate, but for Rome. At least that's what they told themselves. In the days before the assassination, strange omens filled the city. A lioness gave birth in the streets. Lightning struck temples. The soothsayers warned that Caesar should beware the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month. Even his wife Calpurnia dreamt of his statue bleeding from 100 wounds. She begged him not to go to the Senate that morning. For a moment Caesar hesitated. He had conquered the world, yet he could not dismiss the trembling voice of the woman beside him. He agreed to stay home. But then came Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, cloaked in friendship. He mocked the idea of fear. He reminded Caesar that the Senate awaited him, that to hide would make him seem weak, cowardly, unworthy of Rome's leader. And Caesar, proud and unwilling to appear afraid, rose from his chair. "What is to be, will be," he said. "Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant taste death but once." And so Julius Caesar went to the Senate. It was the morning of March 15th, 44th BCE. The air was cool, still, deceptively peaceful. Caesar entered the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting, a cruel irony that he would die beneath the statue of the man he once defeated. As he took his seat, the senators surrounded him. At first they smiled and greeted him with respect. Then one man approached with a petition, a request to pardon his exiled brother. Caesar waved him away. The man grabbed his toga, pulling it down from his shoulder. The signal. In an instant, steel flashed. Caesar staggered as the first knife struck him in the neck. Another pierced his ribs, then another. He turned, stunned, seeing faces he knew, friends, allies, men he had trusted with his life. He tried to fight back, but there were too many. The senators swarmed him, their blades rising and falling like waves, and then, through the chaos, he saw one face. Brutus, the man he loved like a son. Their eyes met, and in that moment something inside Caesar broke. Et tu, Brute, even you, my son. He no longer fought. He pulled his toga over his head, as if to shield himself from what was left of the world, and fell beneath the statue of Pompey, the conqueror dying at the feet of the conquered. 23 wounds. No one tried to save him. The great Julius Caesar, the man who had changed the world, lay still on the marble floor of Rome. When the news spread, the city exploded in panic. The senators had expected cheers, but Rome wept. People locked themselves in their homes, shops closed, the streets filled with silence and fear. At Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony spoke. He raised his voice before the crowd, reading Caesar's will, how he had left money to every citizen, how he had given his gardens to the people. And then, holding up Caesar's blood-stained cloak, he cried out, "Here was a man who loved Rome more than those who killed him." The crowd rioted. The assassins fled for their lives, and the republic they claimed to save burned in their absence. In death, Caesar became even greater than in life. His name was whispered like a prayer. His image shone like a god. The people built temples in his honor. Comets blazed in the night sky, and many said it was his soul ascending to the heavens. The Senate, trembling in guilt, declared him Divine Julius, the first Roman to be made a god. But the Republic was finished. The very act meant to restore freedom had destroyed it forever. In the years that followed, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, would avenge him, defeat his killers, and rise as Rome's first emperor. The age of the Republic had ended. The age of the Empire had begun. And through it all, one truth remained. The man they tried to kill to preserve Rome had become the immortal symbol of Rome itself. When the blade fell on Julius Caesar, it did not end a man. It awakened an empire. His death was meant to save the Republic, but it did the opposite. The Senate had struck down one man, and in doing so, they killed the last breath of the old world. Rome would never again be ruled by senators and speeches. From that day on, it would be ruled by emperors, men who wore the shadow of Caesar like a crown. In the chaos that followed his assassination, Rome descended once more into civil war. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend and general, took up his mantle, promising to avenge the fallen dictator. But far away, another man was watching, a quiet, calculating youth, named Gaius Octavius, the adopted son and heir Caesar had named in his will. Few knew him. Fewer still took him seriously. But Octavian carried something no army could defeat: Caesar's name. And in Rome, that name had become divine. As the city mourned, comets blazed across the night sky. A bright flame streaking above the Forum, seen by thousands. People said it was Caesar's soul, rising to the heavens to take his place among the gods. Temples were built in his honor. His statue was crowned with laurel. The Senate, trembling with guilt and awe, decreed him Divus Julius, Julius the Divine. The man they had feared in life, they worshipped in death. And in that divine silence, his heir stepped forward to claim the world he left behind. The struggle between Mark Antony and Octavian was brutal, a war not just of armies, but of ideals. Antony, bound to Cleopatra, represented the East, luxury, wealth, and passion. Octavian stood for Rome, discipline, order, and destiny. It was more than politics. It was the final echo of Caesar's story. Because once again, two visions of the world clashed, one born of love and ambition, the other born of calculation and fate. At Actium, the two sides met upon the sea. Antony's ships burned, Cleopatra fled. And when all hope was lost, both chose death over surrender. Octavian returned to Rome alone, victorious. He had avenged Caesar. He had ended the civil wars, and in doing so, he completed what his adoptive father had begun. The Republic was gone. The Roman Empire was born. Octavian took a new name, Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. And so, the legacy of Julius Caesar did not die on the Ides of March. It lived on, in every coin, every monument, every emperor who took his name as a title. For centuries, rulers across the world, from Rome to Russia, from empires to kingdoms, would call themselves Caesar. Tsar, Kaiser, a word that once belonged to a man, now became a symbol of dominion itself. But beyond the blood and power, Caesar's true legacy lay in something greater. He had shown the world the power of vision, that a single mind, armed with conviction and courage, could bend the destiny of nations. That charisma could command legions, and ideas could outlive empires. His reforms reshaped time itself. The Julian calendar still marks our days. His words, written in the commentaries, remain models of leadership and clarity. His story, 2,000 years later, still echoes through every tale of ambition, greatness, and fall. But perhaps the greatest irony of all is that Caesar never called himself emperor. He sought to save the Republic, to restore order, to build something eternal. And in that pursuit, he became the very thing he swore never to be. His life was a warning and a prophecy. Because every great dreamer who dares to change the world walks the same razor's edge between genius and ruin, glory and doom. And so ends the tale of Julius Caesar, a man who conquered the known world, was killed by his own friends, and became a god in the hearts of his enemies. 2,000 years have passed, but the question still lingers, whispered through the corridors of history. Was he Rome's greatest hero, or its most dangerous man? Perhaps he was both, because Julius Caesar was not just a man. He was an idea, and ideas, once born, can never truly die.